Parent Requests and School District Obligations with Ellen Kimbrell, Assistant Director of the Oklahoma Parents Center, and Andrea Kunkel, Director of Oklahoma Directors of Special Services. March 12th, 2025, Cirque's Wisdom Wednesday webinar series.
Thank you all for joining us. I am Dr. Allison Conch. I'm the Assistant Director of Special Education Resolution Center, or CIRC, as many refer to us. We appreciate you taking some time to join this webinar, and we are so grateful and privileged to have Ellen Kimbrell and Andrea Kunkel here with us. Ellen is the Associate Director of Oklahoma Parent Center, which is Oklahoma's parent training and information center for the state. And Andrea is the Executive Director of the Oklahoma Directors of Special Services, and she provides guidance to school districts regarding special ed and IDEA laws. So we're so excited to have you both here to talk through some common parent requests and in turn what the school district is obligated to do related to those requests. So thank you guys both for joining us. And whenever you're ready, take it away and I will hop in with questions through the chat or questions related to lots of calls we get as well. So thank you guys.
Thank you so
Ellen?
much. Go ahead,
There you
Andrea.
go.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. I was excited to be invited to be part of it. And our goal, of course, is to help families navigate this process. And when asked what the top 5 requests were, it was difficult to narrow them down to the 5, but we did our best. And so we're going to go through each 5 of these, the top 5 that we hear from families about. Most of their concerns that we talk to them about. So child fine being one, accommodations, modifications, reading is always a big subject with a lot of families moving forward. FBA behavior, probably our number one, really should be number one. Change of placement and reevaluation. So we're going to be talking about each one of those today in respect to the request from the parent. And then, of course, the obligation of the district. So the first one being child fine, just giving you a scenario of maybe a call we get from a family would be maybe they have verbally talked to the district about concerns they have for their child and their child's learning. And it progresses on, maybe a month or so goes by. It could be behaviorally related where the child's being sent home and the parent is asking verbally, what can we do? How can we help? What can we do? And the school continually, is suspending or just referring the parent to different things and different ideas. And so when they reach out to us, however they've met or heard about us, we talk to them about child find. And sometimes they come to us thinking that whatever they want done, they should be able to have accomplished through the school, and navigating that. And the legal aspect of it is not something I do. I'm not an attorney, but I do talk to them about their obligation to put things in writing, their concerns in writing and things like that to start that process. So I'm sure Andrea can add to that, but that's kind of where the first process starts. We help families where they're at, basically.
In preparing this PowerPoint, you'll find that each of the sections for each of the concerns starts with the part of the policies and procedures manual where you could find information about that topic. And then I've put in some of the information from the policies and procedures that explains basically what the school district's responsibilities are. And then on a slide, usually the final slide in each section, I imagine a scenario where a common request comes up, and then I explain kind of generically what the school district's responsibilities would be. In Ellen's particular situation, I'm going to provide a little more explanation. Sometimes Well, for many years, I worked very closely with schools as a school attorney before I joined COSA 14 years ago. And what I found was that eh, school districts often are listening for the words, please evaluate my child. And they are not taking anything less than those words as parents seeking an evaluation. So I usually encourage schools to pay attention to what it is that they're specifically asking for and try to get into the deeper meaning there. Because if you're having continuing issues or discussions with parents about concerns they have about their child, they just may not know the exact words they should be using to go to the next step. And they may not even understand that the next step is evaluation. The school people may think it's perfectly fine to say, well, we've made all these suggestions and we've tried this and we've tried that. But the school personnel maybe haven't heard the thing that they think triggers their responsibility. So let's say in this case, the parent did come back, as Ellen suggested, with something in writing asking for an evaluation, or they came back and they verbally said, I would like an evaluation of my child. What would you expect the school district to do in that situation? I'm going to skip ahead a couple of slides, and then let's say that this is an initial evaluation. And an initial special education evaluation means that this is essentially the first time the parent is getting or is asking for a special education evaluation. The student isn't already on an IEP. So if the parent came in and said, I would like an evaluation of my child, then the district should have a process. They're required to have a process internally that they use when that request comes up. Sometimes the issue from the district's perspective is that the parent may, for example, bring a concern to the general education teacher, and that teacher may think, I have addressed that satisfactorily. But if the parent is requesting an evaluation, that isn't a decision for one person in the district to make. That teacher should take that information to another person in the district who understands the process that the district is to follow then to respond to that request. So usually once that information, hopefully promptly, gets to that person, then somebody will be in contact with the parents to provide them a copy of their parents' rights in special education, to gather additional information from the parent and from other staff members. And then to complete, there's always a form in special education. And for initial evaluation, there are many, many forms. But almost the very first thing that you would expect the district to do is to start completing what's called a review of existing data form, or a RED. That doesn't have to be done in a meeting, but it often is, where the parent is invited to share information that they have about the student. School district personnel are invited to share it. And when that document is complete, that group decides on what is the next step here. And if there is reason to think that the student may have a disability and needs special education, then the next step that team will recommend is an evaluation of the student. And during that entire process, you would expect district personnel also to be using different evidence-based interventions to assist the child up through the time that an evaluation was taking place. But if you feel like you are asking for something and maybe district personnel aren't responding to it, they may be listening for something and they are not hearing it. So absolutely, I a big believer in the assistance that the Oklahoma Parents Center provides and that CERC provides. They can very ably help you navigate that process, help you compose a letter, help you, get through the process so that you're asking for, maybe help you figure out the thing that you want and put that into words that to the district will be, okay, an evaluation. I have a process, and make sure that that process is followed in the district.
Hey, Andrea,
Yes.
I just want to chime in on some of the notes you were saying. Because I think a lot of times, because parents don't, even a lot of school personnel don't understand all of the intricacies of this unless you're living in the world of special ed, right?
Mhm.
So parents don't understand that, like, oh, well, I went to my child's general education teacher. Well, in a perfect world, everyone in that district should know exactly what to do and where to send that parent if they say the magic words, or even if they don't, because it's that school's obligation, right?
Mhm.
But it's that kind of trickle down of communication, especially in larger districts, that may or may not have occurred. And so oftentimes when we get calls from parents as well, whether they've connected with OPC or not, because usually OPC can guide in that way as well. But if we get calls, we'll say, well, who did you have the conversation with? Because sometimes it's also about finding the right person to understand, for that school personnel to understand, oh, this is what they're asking for. So making sure they get connected to, whether that be the special ed director or someone who knows where to send that information, basically, to start the process. Because like you said, the school, they're the ones that are obligated to do this, right? But unfortunately, that communication chain doesn't always get to the right spots. So are there some things that you advise schools on, Andrea, to make sure that they have this good system in place? Or do you have any, like, tips and tricks on that side of things, to make sure that how they can get that communication out and what that looks like? Or do parents just need to be told to talk to directors? Or do you have any insight on that component, I guess, is my question.
Well, I do like a belt and suspenders approach. So I certainly agree with telling parents, hey, if you feel like you're not being heard, ask for the special education director. But at the same time, I certainly advise districts that on an ongoing basis, you need to be instructing general ed staff members, administrators, everybody, that if somebody is expressing concerns about what sounds like disability, if they are bringing something to the nurse that says, here's some information from my doctor, the child is taking medication for this right now. If we have children that are having persistent disciplinary issues, all of that information needs to find its way promptly to the special education director, or as you said, in a bigger district, whoever the other appropriate people might be. Because of course the parent doesn't know.
Right.
If they're a stranger to this process, they don't know to ask for the special education director. They'll talk to the person who's right there in the classroom with their child. So every district needs to train their personnel about what they do if concerns are presented, whether that goes to, in their district, maybe a lead teacher, maybe it goes to the counselor, maybe it goes to a special education coordinator, whoever it is in that school or district. They need to specifically train, here's how we do this. And I will say right now, the State Department of Education is doing a big federally required monitoring effort of school districts. And one of the things they're doing through that is checking to make sure that every district has a written policy concerning child find, which is exactly what we're talking about, and also that they have written procedures where they're identifying, here's exactly how we do this in our district. And that will be this is the first time those things have ever been asked for by the State Department. This is a new requirement. So those are going to be exceptionally helpful to districts too, to have all that stuff in writing so that Lots of people involved in that process have something right in front of them to say, oh, our procedure is X. And so they'll be much better prepared on that as that process goes forward.
That's good to know. Thanks, Andrea.
Accommodations, modifications, reading intervention programs, and ABA. Boy, is that a mouthful. I mean, we could go on for days on to each one of these topics. But we hear from families often, first of all, we don't get calls from happy families. Typically, they're in a crisis, and one or the other situation is going on. Either their accommodations are not working, or they're not being followed. The parent believes they're not being followed or implemented. They're asking for reading intervention programs. Maybe their child has a diagnosis of dyslexia, or other type of reading struggle, and the parent is asking for a specific reading intervention program, or even a specific ABA being a specific scientist program, and they're asking specifically for that. And so it gets tricky, because we tell families, we can't tell schools what they have to buy or what they have to provide. They just have to make sure it's a free and appropriate in light of your child's circumstances, and making sure it's for the IEP. So they have a hard time understanding that, because they feel like maybe they're getting outside services and they're working so well that if they implemented it at the school at the same level, that they would see even more progress. So this is a big one that we get a lot of calls on.
Okay. I've gone into a little more detail in these slides about a free, appropriate public education. And as Ellen said in the second bullet on this slide, it's the goal of every IEP team to offer an IEP, and this is a legal standard. That's why it sounds so legal, reasonably calculated to enable that child to make progress appropriate in light of their circumstances. So it is difficult, as Ellen said, to explain that the U.S. Supreme Court announced this standard in 2017, and they were asked in the case in which they announced this if they would make it an even higher standard. And they said, no, this is what we think is necessary to implement the IDEA that Congress came up with. So we're not saying that the very best education and the most maximizing supports that could help the student to the maximum level be used by the district. It's something that helps the student make progress appropriate in light of their needs. So that's that can be a hard conversation that districts are having with parents in IEP team meetings, because it's something obviously people can see different ways. I'm skipping the accommodations and modifications, and going to maybe a change in a reading intervention program, or adding ABA services. So let's focus on the reading intervention program. Let's say, for example, the parent brought in an outside diagnosis of dyslexia and asked for the use of a specific reading intervention program, or maybe just one that encompassed certain elements that perhaps the parent feels like the current program does not. In that case, I would absolutely expect the IEP team to meet. And if I was talking to the district, I mean, what I would suggest is this is the point where at this first meeting, this is the point where you're asking questions. What do you see as the weaknesses in the reading intervention program or the services that we're providing right now? Explain, how you think the program that you are requesting or a program that contains these elements would be of assistance. Could we perhaps get an authorization signed by you that would let us talk to the person who evaluated your child so that maybe we could understand that evaluation better than we do? And so that we can, make sure that we can turn that evaluation into specific steps that we need to consider to better meet your child's needs. And ordinarily, districts do have the say over what reading programs they use, et cetera. But if the district's reading program over time has not yielded results, then that's a circumstance where a parent may say, I feel like we've given this one a shot that you've been using, and now we feel like it's time that you moved on to something else, maybe that better addresses the needs of a child who has dyslexia than the one you're using right now. And the team as a whole is obligated to consider that request. And I'll just say, there are quite a few districts now that have changed reading programs as a whole, or had trained their special education teachers in using a different, more targeted reading program that addresses the needs of students who have dyslexia. And when we're talking about a program that meets the needs of a student with dyslexia or a reading impairment, those programs are typically going to be helpful programs for all students, not just students who have dyslexia. So at a minimum, I would expect the team to gather additional information, try to understand better the parent's requests, and the parent is always entitled to, and if they are saying, I am requesting a change in this program, the parent is entitled to an answer to that question within a reasonable period of time. Following, if a decision is made that yes, there will be a change, and here's what it will be through the IEP team process, or the answer is no, we're not making a change, and here's the reason. At the end of that meeting, there should be a written notice that comes about where the district is required to explain, here's what we're agreeing to do or not agreeing to do, and here are the reasons why. And that form can be taken to the Oklahoma Parent Center. It can be talked about with folks from CERC, who can then advise the parent, here's the next step for you if you disagree with the decision that was made.
And Andrea, to
Yes.
clarify on some of these things,
Mhm.
because we get, again, our services sort of overlap a lot with OPC, or sometimes we get calls where they're looking for an advocate, so we refer on. But when parents are coming in and making their requests for like the specific programs, like we're asking about, whether that's through a reading curriculum or a specific like ABA methodology,
Mhm.
if the school were to decline the parent's request for them, and I'm not trying to make it too legalistic here, basically for them to have standing on that, it would be because maybe the district is seeing progress with the existing thing, right? Based on the student's disability needs. And so the extent to which the parent may be able to request a change would be related to the student not making progress in that area, not necessarily because a preferred method or program. Is that accurate?
And remember, this gets back to that FAPE standard that we
Yes.
talked about before,
Yes.
and we can certainly have differences of opinion about whether or not elements of the student's IEP are reasonably calculated to enable the student to make progress appropriate in light of their circumstances. So there may be a legitimate difference of opinion between, certain school staff members and the parent about whether or not the student is making appropriate progress in light of their circumstances. The parent may feel like if it isn't an appropriate level of progress because my child could make a lot more progress, I think, if this was used, while school personnel may feel like that's appropriate under the circumstances, and something else may benefit them further, but we feel like we are meeting the FAPE standard. Of course, as we discussed, that's a tough conversation to have. I mean, what parent wouldn't want their child to benefit the most?
Right.
So, my thought is, what is the explanation that the district is giving? That's why that written notice is so important. Um, for them to write out for the parent, here's the reason, this is the reason why we're deciding this. These are the reasons why we're saying no to what you're asking. And here's the documentation that we're relying on in making that decision. So if you go to CERC, if you go to an advocate, if you go to an attorney, they can take a look at that and say, okay, here's what we see from this.
Thank you. And then just real quick, so sorry, we're okay on time since we're asking questions throughout. We can leave extra time at the end for Q&A, but since there's questions throughout, we're okay until through 1:30 if we need to go that long. And then I had one more follow-up I wanted to ask about the very first topic real quick on child fine, because it hit me about some confusion. Ellen, I don't know if you get some of these calls. I see them on Facebook groups too a lot, with people talking about special ed, of once they've made the request, people are under an impression that or sometimes a wrong impression or a misunderstanding about when the timeline starts. Is it 45 days? Is it 60? When does that start? What is the application there through that child fine process? Can you provide a quick clarification so that's very clear on those evaluation standards?
Right, like when we talked about how a parent put it in writing, request in writing, write that letter, and then we want that response in writing from the district of what they're proposing to do with our request. And if the team determines that they're going to move forward with the initial eval or re-eval or whatever, then the parents it's an initial, so it would be the initial evaluation, and the parent signs consent for that. And the team has determined what kind of assessments they're going to do, then the school district has 45 school days to complete that evaluation and have that multi-educational eligibility group session that is required. So that's, when we talk to families, we tell them IDEA says that it's parents' rights and responsibilities. So I think one of the biggest responsibilities I have as a parent is to educate myself as much as I can about my rights for my child, his rights in school or her rights in school, and also understand the process. Because, okay, my child has reading difficulties. Well, I don't understand the science of reading, but I know my child struggles every night, or whatever the case may be. So, and the language, learning the language, it's so important. So taking the time to invest in the knowledge, learning the information, it's going to make your journey through this advocacy process and supporting your individual so much easier with the knowledge. So I don't know if I went too far with that, but
I that's a great point too, Ellen. Thank you for clarifying that. And I think that's a great point for parents to hear too. Thank you, guys.
oh boy, this is a this is a big one. Functional behavior assessment and behavior intervention plans. Like I said and mentioned, probably about 80% of our calls are behavior related in some form or fashion. And talking to families about the requirement of a functional behavior assessment and what is required by the school to support their student who has behavioral challenges in the district. it can be overwhelmed, because quite frankly, the parent's already overwhelmed by the time they call us. Their child or their individual may have already been, suspended or expelled even from school. And so really working with them at that level, it can be overwhelming because they're dysregulated by all of it. So, and they think it needs to be a qualified, somebody that has their BCBA to come in and do initial things. And so getting them, calm down, and where we can start with that process and helping them understand the responsibility of the school and supporting their student. It's time consuming. I'm sure it is for the district as well, but we want to focus solely on the student if we can, because I think sometimes when parents call us, the conflict is already there with the district and the family. And so, calming that situation down, you got to calm that down before you can ever get to the information. So anyway, go ahead.
Ellen said she spent about 80% of time responding to parents who were calling about behavior related issues for their children. I don't think my percentage is that high when special ed directors contact me, but it's pretty high. I would say at least 50% of the calls and emails that I get are about behavior related issues. So a couple of different things in what Ellen was talking about. First, I want to refer you to the sections of the policies and procedures that talk about FBAs and BIPs, and then give you kind of the description that SDE uses, which is a pretty technical explanation. And then point out that the federal law that we're talking about, the IDEA, really says very little about functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans. Nevertheless, they remain, even though they're not covered very deeply in the IDEA, they are important tools that are used. So I want to suggest a couple of different things to you. One is that school districts in Oklahoma are kind of under a timeline set by the State Department of Education to establish well-functioning, what are called multi-tiered systems of support in their districts to address not only academic needs that students have, but also behavioral needs that students have, so that they are in a much better position to provide evidence-based interventions for all students than for students for whom those general interventions are not necessarily working as well as one would expect. And then yet another tier, yet a third tier for that much smaller group of students for whom even those enhanced evidence-based interventions are not working. So the districts right now are in a multi-year process of developing those systems. Some are farther along than others, but they are all working toward that goal. Now, I realize that in the here and now, every single person wants to have an answer right now, but districts are working through a process which is very individualized to each district, not something that is going to look the same in any two districts in developing that. So districts hopefully are offering different levels of evidence-based interventions to address behavior issues. And when students have more significant behavior issues, that the districts have more significant evidence-based interventions to assist the students and assist families. So if a parent asks a district to conduct an FBA and develop a behavior intervention plan, I would absolutely expect an IEP team meeting to discuss the issue. And if there have been, some pretty significant behavior issues or disciplinary responses to that, then I would expect district personnel to have the same kind of concerns that the parent does about that. How do we address these issues? If the team agreed, yes, at this time, a functional behavior assessment is what we need, that FBA is an assessment, and it requires written consent, just like any other type of individualized assessment that the district would administer to that student. So the parent would be asked to sign a consent form to do that. That could be done as part of an initial evaluation, or it might be that the student is already on an IEP and maybe a year or two before the student's 3-year reevaluation comes up, the idea for an FBA comes up. And in that case, the district, could absolutely make a decision that let's just go ahead and do that FBA piece right now and seek parent consent just to do that one thing. Why would a district decide not to do an FBA? And if you look at the language in the policies and procedures manual, it really suggests one of the bigger reasons why a district wouldn't. It could be that the district feels like it is premature to do that because we are implementing through our multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS, what's called a tier 2 evidence-based intervention to see if that is going to be effective before doing a functional behavior assessment. But the FBA is really considered the big, the appropriate step when we've got dangerous behavior or significant behaviors that aren't yielding to other evidence-based interventions. And the functional behavior assessment, the State Department of Education has identified what type of training the person who does that functional behavior assessment needs to have, because it needs to be a person who is skilled in the process of analyzing student behavior. Because the point of this is really to make an informed decision, to develop an informed hypothesis about what the trigger is for that behavior, and how to replace that behavior with something that is more appropriate, that will get the student the same thing that they may feel like they're getting from that inappropriate behavior. And somebody who can train staff members how to implement an appropriate behavior intervention plan for that student. So absolutely, it's in everybody's interest to make sure that the person who is tasked with doing that FBA and kind of is leading that team and developing the behavior intervention plan has had the appropriate training. Ellen mentioned before, sometimes parents want a BCBA, which is a certified behavior analyst. To do that, the State Department doesn't require that, although a certified behavior analyst is certainly one of the people who can conduct it. But if the parent has that request, then the district is absolutely obligated to consider whether or not that is necessary under the circumstances. BCBAs are kind of hard to come by for school districts. There are maybe a handful of districts in the state that actually have a BCBA on staff. Others may have somebody that they consult with. And others, they may not have a BCBA anywhere around. Nevertheless, certified school psychologists almost always have had appropriate and extensive behavior training as well, and are also qualified to do that. And so, I always suggest that, let's find the best qualified person that we can under the circumstances, and see if we can get their assistance to get that done, and to help guide the team, because anything, even an FBA, even a BIP, for the benefits they bring, do not bring instantaneous results. most of the time. Most of the time, those are going to be long-term things that are in place, because even though certain behaviors may improve, they may be replaced with a new behavior that is also challenging. So you want that continuing assistance from a skilled person to guide the team in addressing evolving behavior concerns. Again, whatever the team decides, they're obligated to provide the parent a written notice form that explains, here's the answer. So if the parent has asked for, I want a functional behavior assessment and I want a behavior intervention plan, whatever the team answer to that is, whatever the district answer to that is, then the written notice should explain in some detail why the district is responding as it is, with either a yes or a no, or we're doing this part of this, but not this other part of this, in an explanation that the parent can understand, so that the parent, in seeking assistance from someone, can, that person can help them figure out a next step. And again, this gets back to that vape issue that Allison asked about before. If the answer is no, it again may be because district personnel feel like the student is progressing appropriately concerning their behavior issues, while the parent may feel like that I'm not seeing that progress, or the progress is too slow, or my student is still having maybe an occasional removal from school. And to the school district, they may feel like the removal is not that significant because it doesn't involve that many days over an entire school year, while the parent may feel like any days of removal over the school year are too many days. So it's another one of those situations where there can be a very legitimate difference of opinion between folks who are really looking at the same information.
I think they're great points, Andrea. And one of the things you mentioned about the removals, again, I think there's some misperceptions in terms of like, well, once a student's on an IEP or once they have a BIP, well, now they can never be suspended or whatever the case may be. But those things, both of those things are documentation that outline the supports the school is providing to the student to meet their educational needs. But it doesn't mean now it's a magic wand. Like you mentioned, it can take time to start working. Things are still, I mean, there's still human beings involved. There's still a disability involved. And that may mean, much like on an IEP, to address some goals and services for reading or math progress, they may need to meet frequently to address and adjust those behavioral interventions to find out what's working. But it doesn't mean now they're like immune from a code of conduct and the rules of the school district, right? Ellen, I don't know if you have more insight. You probably do, in terms of what parents are.
As long as I don't see that the child will follow the school rules 100% of the time on the IEP, which I've seen not just once, but several times. We do. I mean, what I tell families is, there's cause and effect for everything, and consequences to everything, regardless if you have a disability or behavior challenging, but whatever the case may be. I want families to understand that it's our goal and their team, I always say the team's goal is to help that student become the best independent student they can be. And that includes behavior, because there's consequences to our behavior, good and bad. And society doesn't look at, oh, he has a disability, so it's okay for them to behave that way. And to a certain extent, maybe, but we want to teach children and adults that they can tolerate society, and society can handle them in a way that is appropriate. And because they're going to be 18 at some point, this is what was stuck with me, is my child's going to be 18 at some point. He's going to be an adult, and I'm not going to always be there. And so if there's behavioral challenges going on, let's support those now. Let's provide those interventions now, because before they get to that point where society is going to handle that. So but not 100% of the time, because no child follows the rules 100% of the time. No,
No adults do either, right?
no, that's right. That's right.
One other point about that is, there are often, disagreements between school personnel and parents where a parent might say, my child doesn't do that at home. And so parents may doubt that behavior is happening at school. And it's important to remember that expectations are probably very different at school than they are at home. That yes, accommodations can be made at school. However, the things that it's very individual what families think is appropriate behavior at home and what is not appropriate behavior. And at school, a lot of the time, the expectations are going to be very different. So I think that's a situation where folks need to have that understanding. And it may be, I like the related service of parent counseling and training because I feel like if schools are saying, I'm, you know, the student has difficulty transitioning from one activity to the next, let's say. And that's where we're seeing a lot of our issues. And we have developed this process that we use that. That might be, and the parent is saying, I'm not seeing that at all. It might be an occasion where we say, parent, let's come up and let us demonstrate for you how we do that. Or please explain to us how you do that at home if you're seeing success with limiting time, let's say on a computer, and you have a way of letting the child know that transition to a less preferred activity is coming up and you're not having the issues that we're having. We absolutely want to know that because you may have found a way to address that we just aren't seeing here. And if we could have the benefit of you explaining how you're doing that, that would just be great. So it's not always a situation where the school is saying, well, we're doing it better. Sometimes the school is saying, we're not having success with this. And if you are having success, absolutely, please, can you video something to show us what the routine is? Maybe we just all need to be doing it the same way. Not that you have to be doing it our way. Maybe we can learn from the way you do it. And that would work better for us. And, remove an issue that we're having so that the student isn't having to adjust to two completely different ways of, accomplishing the same thing. So I just see that sharing as a two-way street here and, maybe more important in the area of behavior than it is in anything else that the school is trying to address with the student.
That's huge. That's a great point, Andrea. And
It is a
and forming
great
those
point.
real partnerships, right,
It
between
is.
the parent and the school.
It's so important because, families do, the trust issue is so, they lose when you lose trust with the district for what, let's say your child has been having challenging behaviors and maybe the child got injured, during one of the meltdown, whatever you want to call it. And then the trust really go. I mean, we could go on, but trust is big, and families have to work with the team. And what Andrea said, and allowing a parent to feel empowered and engaged in that process. Because oftentimes they don't feel welcome. They don't feel like their voice is being heard. And that's why we get those calls, is they're not listening to me. I'm telling them, I've told them, I've given them strategies. So working together and listening for understanding is so important, so important.
One other thing, and I feel like sometimes parents can feel judged or thought of as less than good parents when their children are engaging in behavior issues at school. And so I think it's important for school personnel to handle those discussions where they're they're accurately describing what they're seeing, but leaving the judgment beside, because that can, I think, this is just my personal opinion, that can really, damage that trust relationship and that desire for the parent to share the information, and really to say, if you've got all the answers, then, come up with a plan, and not to feel, so much like a team member if they don't feel like they're being treated like a team member. So I think that's just critical in the context of behavior too.
Andrea, I think you can probably address this in terms of school, because there's a question in our Q&A, school supports and what they're able to do here. Do you only do an FBA for a student in special ed? Can you not have a behavior problem but no disability?
Sure, you can absolutely do that. And certainly students who are on 504 plans can have functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans. And even students who are not identified as having a disability can have a functional behavior assessment and a behavior intervention plan. And of course, the IDEA rules for what that would look like would be different, but still, if a parent thought that their child needed to have some sort of an assessment as a non-disabled child, the district could certainly seek consent for doing some sort of an assessment, and then develop a behavior intervention plan that everybody, to me, it's like another intervention, another evidence-based intervention. There was a guidance document that came out maybe in December or January from
yes.
the U.S. Department of Education about that topic. But of course, we've changed administrations since then, and I honestly don't know whether or not that document continues to represent, the what the current administration would support. They haven't spoken to any of those issues, but I think there's a place for that in as part of a multi-tiered system of support for students with and without disabilities.
We just for those who are watching live or the recorded version, we had a write-up on this in one of our Circ Scoops or Able Tech newsletter, but this guidance is out there from the USDE about how to support behavior for all students. And Andrea, that's what I'm envisioning again, as the school districts are working to shore up their MTSS, that multi-tiered system of support. It's not just about academics. And so technically it would be, even if it's not a formal assessment, potentially a really strong behavioral intervention plan, so to speak, through MTSS, because they're providing interventions and tracking data on outcomes, right? So it might meet that same goal and intention without having a formal next step, potentially. Is that accurate?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Change of placement. When families call us, we try, like I said, we help them where they're at. And one of the big things we try to focus on with families is what we call the Super Six, the 6 principles of IDEA. And change of placement, least restrictive environment, is something that it's one of the Super Six, and it's one of the things we talk about. But oftentimes families struggle because they feel like, and again, we use the word feel, and if I've learned anything, we don't think and feel anything in special ed. Everything is data driven. And so that's what we talk to families about. What is the data saying about because they're recommending, let's say the child's in general education placement, and the school is wanting to change the child placement into a more restricted, into a smaller special education program, and the parent is not comfortable, not in agreement with it. And so I try to talk to them about pros and cons of both, and why the school may be wanting to do that, and the data, just looking at the data. So I don't know what Andrew will say to that, but we get families that want that or don't want that. And so it happens on both sides. So
Ellen's right. I certainly get calls from directors who are explaining that parents want their child in a more restrictive setting than maybe the teachers for that student think is appropriate. They feel like maybe the expectations in the general education classroom are too rigorous, or maybe that they feel like there are additional accommodations or modifications that would be necessary, and they think overall that a more restrictive setting would be more appropriate for their child, while there are others who feel like you're proposing something that's more restrictive for my student than is necessary. And so what could we do in that general education setting with modifications, accommodations and supplementary aids and services to enable them to, perform satisfactorily in that setting? So what I've put on the slides here is just where to look for information in the policies and procedures manual about educational placement or least restrictive environment, and then this continuum of alternative placements, with the general education classroom all the time on one end of that spectrum, and then instruction in hospitals and institutions on the far end of the spectrum, and then multiple steps in between that might turn out to be the least restrictive environment for that student under the circumstances. A couple of things that I just wanted to point out. Sometimes school districts have parents who come in and the first thing that they want to talk about is the student's placement. And what I would expect the district folks to say is, and this information comes right out of the policies and procedures manual, that the IEP is set up in the sequence that it is for a reason. And we identify the student's educational needs first and what their strengths are. Then we identify what goals are necessary for the student, what services are necessary, and then the team figures out and what is the least restrictive environment in which those services can be implemented for this student. Those decisions are absolutely not supposed to be based on the student's disability category, but on the needs individual to that student that result from the disability. So I would expect all the time for the team to be considering the general education setting for the student and whether or not there is some combination of available supplementary aids and services, which could include supports for personnel. Maybe they are not sure how to carry out their responsibilities for a student. They might need some training, plus modifications and accommodations that enable the student to access the setting, to access the curriculum in that setting. And then to determine whether or not the student can satisfactorily, and that's the decision right out of the wording right out of the regulation, satisfactorily, not perfectly, not at the highest possible level, but satisfactorily in that setting. So that's consistently with FAPE, what's appropriate for the student. It's that kind of middle ground, satisfactorily, that gives the team flexibility in deciding what the student needs under the circumstances. So the team is going to make an annual decision about the student's placement, but let's say that we're partway through the school year and the parent feels like, my child is in the special education setting, but I just don't think that setting is meeting my child's needs. I feel like um, they need the benefit academically, socially, from, just being around their peers, modeling the behavior of their peers, um, being in those social situations with their peers. I want an IEP meeting mid-year to discuss those issues and what my concerns are. And I would absolutely expect the team to do that and for the parent to lay out their case for it. And it's incumbent on the school. uh, it's not that every student is going to be in what is the generic least restrictive environment, which is regular education setting 100% of the time. But I would expect the decisions to be made about maybe we are not setting a rigorous enough standard for the student. Maybe our services really are um, maybe our goals are not as rigorous as they should be. Maybe the services that we're providing, maybe that assumption that we need direct special education instruction in these areas, maybe that was the wrong choice. Maybe we need to attempt a less restrictive setting where the student is participating more in the general education curriculum to try modifications and accommodations that would enable the student to be in the general education classroom for more academic activities, maybe instead of just limiting that to specials, that not always focusing exclusively on the academics of that situation, but remembering that we should be considering the non-academic benefits that students may get from that, the social benefits that they may get. Um, and I would expect the team to have those discussions, and be open to suggestion about, can we give this a try? Can we give that a try? Realizing that teams can talk about appropriate changes of placement at any point during the school year if they find that they've done something that might be too restrictive in a way, or um, not sufficiently restrictive, that maybe we thought that the student could perform satisfactorily for in the general education classroom for this subject matter, but maybe instead our student needs to be in the general education classroom to get that initial instruction and then to move into the special education setting after they've had that instruction for some reteaching of that concept by the special education teacher. Or maybe we need to deliver that instruction in a special education setting. So that could look all sorts of different ways, but it's absolutely something that can be brought up at any time by the team. And again, whatever the decision of the team is, there should be a detailed written notice that explains, here is the decision that was made in response to whoever brought up the request, and here are the reasons for it. One other thing I just might mention quickly is that sometimes teams make a decision, particularly for students with who are at the secondary level, about services being provided in a special education setting. Maybe a student leaves a general education setting to go to a special education setting. And sometimes students at that level will make their own decision, regardless of what the team decided, that they do or don't want to leave the general education setting to go into a special ed setting. They may feel like, no, I just don't want to go to that setting and get that. And if something like that happens, I would expect the team to be meeting about that and saying, we decided this, but the child has decided on their own that they're not going to take advantage of that service. So let's talk about what we might be able to add to the IEP as an accommodation or a modification or as a service that would take the place of the one that the child is telling us they are not going to take advantage of, because we put that in there for a reason. Yet, we're not going to take a student by the arm and say, you're going to the special education classroom to get this instruction. We want to support them where they feel like they need to be. And, let's figure out how we're going to work through that issue.
Brings a point to my mind about self-advocacy and learning about your disability and understanding how your disability affects your ability to learn in the general education classroom. So important. And I'm going to impress, you can never start too early. I mean, the sooner the better, teaching your child, and helping them understand. So, because when they do become an adult, they'll have that skill already built in and won't have to learn it in the workforce or wherever. So, just helping them know that.
I think it's really important for districts to have some sort of information gathering process from general education teachers about, and the student and the parent about what supports they think are most useful for the students and what supports really aren't useful for the students in particular classes. Because this, it's so hard to find the right time to write an IEP, because what you want are teachers that have experience with the student. And, depending on when you write your IEP, you might be doing it at the end of one school year before the next group of teachers really knows the student, or halfway through the school year where they didn't know them to begin with, but they know them now. But next school year, they're going to spend some time with folks who don't know them. So, what I'm saying is it's hard to get all the right information at exactly the right moment you need it from the correct people who have the right level of knowledge about a child. So I still think that information gathering, and especially from the student about what they find helpful and what they do not find helpful, I think that information should be in the team's hands when they are making decisions. It would be ideal if the student attended the IEP team meeting, and ideal if every student or every teacher who worked with a student could be present in an IEP meeting, but that's not what the law requires, and that is darn near impossible to make happen. So some sort of process in the district that will help teams make appropriate decisions about the appropriate setting and the appropriate supports in that setting would be fabulous, much needed.
I agree.
Allison, do you have anything?
Shockingly, not on this one. I think you guys covered it, and I love your insight in terms of I think the self-advocacy part, Ellen, that you mentioned is such a big deal. I've experienced where some families are saying that they don't want to tell their child about their disability. Where I've had to sort of counsel families to say, hey, when they're like 14, they're going to be invited to their meeting. Like, you need to be the person have this conversation with them. Like, the school shouldn't be the first person telling them, here's what's up with you. It needs to come from that parent should be having those open and honest conversations. So I think that is a great perspective. Andrea, I appreciate your thought on making sure all those supports are accurate for the right class too. Because sometimes they end up being some blanket accommodations or some things like you mentioned that maybe the child really doesn't need and they only need for this class. And what does that look like? And what keeps them successful? And ultimately, it also keeps going back to what we discussed earlier, that FAPE, that obligation to provide that free and appropriate public education. That's the school's obligation. And so ultimately they have to make that call, right? In terms of these are the goals, these are accommodations, this is how we can provide the service that allows for the child to make that progress based upon their unique circumstances. And so I think there can be lots of issues surrounding this topic, but I think you guys covered it really, really well.
Good, thank you. Reevaluation. So, I mean, we get this a lot, and let's say that the parent has had a reevaluation done on their own, and it has shown new things, different things, and they're asking the school to take into consideration their information. In the schools, we're not seeing this. Maybe they have a new diagnosis of autism, with the private evaluation, and the school we're not seeing that this is in input. I'm sorry, affecting their education at all with this new diagnosis. And so we've looked at your information, but we're not. So the school would then need to provide information as to what they're seeing as far as data. So the parent asks for a reevaluation. So it becomes really an issue of just becoming testing. And then there's the concern about the evaluation being invalid because it was done more within that year. So there's lots of questions that swirl around reevaluation. Is it who's responsible? Is the timeline the same? And so we answer those, but hearing the schools, what their obligation is very important for families to understand. So I don't know if I gave you a good scenario there or not, Andrea, but I was trying to think of, because we do. Yeah. Okay, good. Okay.
Okay. Just the basics. This is different than the initial evaluation because that's the first one. A reevaluation is any subsequent evaluation that follows that initial. So the process is required at least every 3 years, but it could happen more often. But it's not supposed to happen under the IDEA more than once a year unless both the parent and the district say, okay, yeah, there's a reason to get that done. Here are the reasons why a reevaluation would be performed. Of course, we want to know whether the student continues to have a disability, whether they continue to need that special education and related services, but also kids have changing educational needs. We need to keep up with that. We need to know where they're currently performing, because we don't want to keep covering ground that the student has already mastered because we don't have a clear idea of where they are functioning. And we need to figure out whether or not there are things we need to do differently. Sometimes I think it could probably be tempting in IEP meetings to say, what we're doing is working so well, let's keep doing that. But we might need to add something, or something really may just be in there because it's habit, and we might need to replace it with something else. Or the student may be, meeting their goals, on a schedule that is, quicker than what we might have anticipated. And we might really need some additional information to help us figure out how to make our decisions better. So let's say that this is exactly what Ellen said. Let's say the parent asks for additional assessment, and let's say it's more than a year from the last evaluation, but it's before that 3-year period. Or it could be a situation where the district is saying, hey, it's time for our 3-year reevaluation, but we don't think there's any need to do any additional assessments at this time. And the parent may say, I think there is a need to do more assessment for one of those reasons that's covered on the previous slide. Then that needs to be the subject of an IEP meeting. But I think no, I didn't. Okay, I thought I added an additional thing here, but let's talk about the situation where a parent brings in an outside reevaluation that they've had done. And that is a pretty common thing. And I think it's really helped school districts that the policies and procedures that are in place right now very specifically set out what school districts are supposed to do and how they are supposed to do that when parents bring in an outside reevaluation. It's not a matter of the district just taking that and saying, thank you very much for this evaluation, and then putting in a folder. There's an actual process that has to be followed, paperwork that has to be concluded, discussions that they need to have about that evaluation. It has to be considered. It doesn't have to be embraced. You know, Ellen said that the district may say, we're not seeing this, but it needs to be discussed in a team meeting. And I always recommend to district personnel, if you're looking at something and you disagree with it, then ask the parent for consent to talk to the evaluator about it. Say, what is it that you are seeing that we just aren't seeing? And I'm going to throw this one thing in because I found it really helpful. Over the last year and a half or something like that, the Office for Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Education was putting out these specific disability related fact sheets, and they were made for, it really was for the 504 process in